Sometimes the greatest warriors are those who've laid down their swords. Sometimes the most powerful people are those the world has forgotten. In a small Viking village called Frosvik, a giant named Bjornulf lives alone. He was once a feared berserker, but now he speaks to no one. The villagers avoid him. When an old woman named Asleif comes begging for help against raiders, everyone turns away. But Bjornulf doesn't. He takes his axe and walks into the night. By morning, 3 raiders are dead. The village remembers his strength, but then the Jarl arrives asking questions. He wants to know who killed his men. The old woman knows something she's never told anyone, a secret from long ago. What did Asleif see that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sea mist rolled across the wooden walkways of Frosvik like the breath of ancient gods, carrying with it the salt tang of memories and the weight of unspoken histories. Here, where the fjord carved deep into the mountainside, 37 souls made their living from the bounty of both sea and soil. The longhouses stood in weathered rows, their timber darkened by decades of coastal storms, each one telling its own story of survival against the harsh northern elements. At the far end of the settlement, where the organized rows gave way to wild heather and granite outcroppings, stood a dwelling that seemed to exist in a world apart. Smaller than the others, built with the precision of a man who had once understood that his life might depend on the strength of every joint and beam, it housed the village's most enigmatic resident. Bjornulf Ironhand, though few dared speak his full name anymore, had arrived in Frosvik 7 winters ago. He had come walking down the coast road on a morning when the snow fell so thick that children could barely see. Their own hands before their faces. No horse, no cart, no companions, just a giant of a man with shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of the world, carrying a leather satchel and an axe that had seen more battles than most men had seen. Sunrises. The village blacksmith, Thorvald, still remembered that morning with crystal clarity. He had been working his forge when the stranger's shadow fell across his doorway, blocking out what little light the storm allowed. When Thorvald looked up, he found himself staring at a man who stood nearly a head taller than anyone in the village, with arms like oak trees and hands that could crush stone. But it was the eyes that Thorvald remembered most, blue as glacier ice, but somehow hollow, as if they had seen too much and now preferred to see nothing at all. "I need shelter for the winter," the stranger had said, his voice carrying the accent of the eastern settlements. "I can pay my way." From his satchel he had produced a handful of silver, coins bearing the mark of distant jarls, more wealth than most villagers saw in a year. But when Thorvald had started to speak of payment and terms, the giant had simply placed the entire handful on the anvil. "This should cover several winters," Bjornulf had said. "I prefer to be left alone." And for 7 years, that arrangement had suited everyone perfectly. Bjornulf had built his dwelling with his own hands, accepting no help and offering none. He hunted in the deep woods and fished from the rocky shores, always alone, always silent. At the seasonal gatherings, he would appear like a ghost at the edge of the firelight, accept his portion of ale and meat with a nod, and disappear again before the songs began. Children would dare each other to run past his door, then shriek with delighted terror when they glimpsed his massive silhouette through the windows. The older villagers whispered stories. Eric the Wise, whose grandfather had fought alongside kings, claimed he recognized the fighting stance Bjornulf unconsciously adopted when startled the loose-limbed readiness of a berserker who had survived battles that killed lesser men. Ingrid Ravenhair, the village's eldest woman and keeper of genealogies, swore she had seen his like before. Men who had served in the personal guard of great Jarls and had been marked forever by what they had done in service to their lords. But it was Asleif who knew the truth. Asleif, Brightweaver had been a beauty once, in the days when her hair caught sunlight like spun gold, and her laugh could make even the most hardened warriors pause in their conversations. She had served in the court of Jarl Magnus the Stern, not as a warrior or even as nobility, but as something far more valuable, a healer whose knowledge of herbs and bone-setting had kept the Jarl's household alive through plagues and battles that would have decimated lesser settlements. Now, at 73 winters, she lived alone on a small farmstead, an hour's walk from the village proper. Her hair had turned silver-white, and her back bore the curve of decades spent bent over herb gardens and sickbeds. But her mind remained sharp as a well-honed blade, and her memory held secrets that could topple kingdoms. She had recognized Bjornulf the moment he arrived in Frosvik, though she had given no sign of that recognition. She knew why his eyes held such emptiness, why he flinched slightly at sudden sounds, why his hands sometimes trembled in the morning before he had work to occupy them. She had seen the aftermath of what Jarls demanded of their most loyal men, had stitched wounds and set bones, and held dying warriors as they confessed sins that would never be spoken aloud in any hall. Bjornulf had been Jarl Magnus's shadow, his final solution to problems that could not be solved with diplomacy or even honest warfare. When enemies needed to disappear without trace, when justice required a hand that would never be connected to the throne, when mercy itself demanded a swift end to suffering that honor would not allow. That was when Magnus would speak a single word to his most trusted servant, and Bjornulf would vanish into the night. Asleif had tended the wounds he brought back from those missions, had watched him grow more silent and more hollow with each task completed. She had been present the night he finally stood before Jarl Magnus and spoke the words that sealed his exile. "I can serve you no more, my lord. My soul is full." Magnus had been surprisingly gentle in his response. Perhaps even Jarls understood that some wells once emptied could never be refilled. "Then go with my blessing, Iron Hand. But if you speak of what you have done in my service, I will have no choice but to treat such words as the ravings of an enemy." The threat was clear, but so was the affection beneath it. Bjornulf had served faithfully for 15 years, and Magnus was not a man to forget such loyalty. The exile was real, but it was also a kind of mercy, a chance for a broken man to find peace, if peace could still be found. For 7 years, that arrangement had held. Bjornulf had found his corner of the world and had asked nothing from it except solitude. Asleif had tended her herbs and her memories, speaking to few and trusting fewer. The village of Frosvik had provided them both with the gift of anonymity, a place where past deeds could be buried beneath the daily rhythm of survival. But on this grey morning in late autumn, as the first serious snows began to dust, the mountains and the fishing boats were pulled high onto the shore for winter storage. That peaceful isolation was about to shatter like ice beneath a hammer blow. The trouble began before dawn, when Asleif's goat started bleating with an urgency that brought her instantly awake. At her age, sleep was light and easily broken, but the sound that cut through her dreams was not the ordinary complaint of animals wanting their morning grain. This was panic, raw and desperate. She pulled on her wool cloak and stepped out into the grey pre-dawn light to find her small farmyard in chaos. The gate to her goat pen had been torn from its hinges, and 3 of her 5 animals were gone. The remaining 2 huddled against the far wall of their enclosure, eyes wide with terror. But it was the state of her herb garden that made her blood run cold. Decades of careful cultivation lay trampled and torn. Rare plants that she had nurtured from seeds, traded from distant lands, crushed beneath boots and hooves. Her drying racks had been overturned, scattering precious winter stores across the muddy ground. Whoever had done this had not been interested in mere theft. This was destruction for its own sake, the kind of casual cruelty that spoke of men who took pleasure in breaking things that could not fight back. Near the ruins of her gate, pressed deep into the soft earth, she found the prints that confirmed her worst fears. 3 horses, heavily loaded, with riders wearing the kind of boots favored by men who lived by violence rather than honest labor. Raiders from the outer settlements, most likely the kind of masterless men who preyed on isolated farmsteads as winter approached and easy targets grew scarce. She knew, with the certainty of age and experience, that they would be back. They had marked her as vulnerable, alone, with no man to defend her property. They would return with more men and finish what they had started, taking her remaining animals, her stored food, and quite possibly her life, if she proved troublesome. For a moment, she stood in the wreckage of her life's work and felt the weight of her years settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was too old to start over, too weak to defend herself, too proud to abandon the land she had worked so hard to cultivate. But then, as the first light of true dawn began to paint the eastern mountains, she thought of the giant who lived in silence at the edge of Frosvik. She thought of scars she had stitched and wounds she had tended, of a man who had once been the most feared warrior in 3 kingdoms. She thought of debts that had never been spoken aloud, but had never been forgotten. And Asleif Brightweaver, who had once held the confidence of Jarls and had never in her long life begged for anything, gathered her courage and began the long walk to the village. The morning mist was just beginning to lift from the fjord when she stumbled into the square where the villagers were beginning their daily routines. Her appearance brought immediate silence. This woman who kept to herself, who traded herbs for necessities but otherwise sought no contact, now stood before them with mud on her skirts and desperation in her eyes. "Please," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet square with the authority of someone who had once commanded attention in much grander halls. "I need help. Raiders came in the night." The response was exactly what she had expected. Eyes averted, feet shuffled, conversations resumed in carefully lowered voices. These were good people, but they were fishermen and farmers, not warriors. They had families to protect and could not risk drawing the attention of violent men for the sake of one old woman's troubles. All except one. From the edge of the square, where the shadows still clung to the walls of the outermost buildings, a figure emerged. Bjornulf moved with the deceptive quiet of very large men who have learned to carry their size gracefully, each step deliberate and sure. He stopped before Asleif, and for a moment that stretched like a held breath, their eyes met. In that glance, 7 years of careful anonymity fell away. She saw recognition in his hollow gaze, and something else, a flicker of the man he had once been, before duty and service had carved away everything that was soft in him. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked toward the edge of the village, toward his small dwelling where an axe waited that had tasted the blood of men far more dangerous than common raiders. And Asleif, understanding that some debts transcend words, followed him into the growing light of what would prove to be a day that changed everything. The interior of Bjornulf's dwelling spoke of a man who had learned to live with only what was necessary. No decorations graced the walls, no tapestries softened the harsh angles of timber and stone. A simple bed, a table hewn from a single piece of pine, shelves holding basic tools and provisions. Everything was arranged with military precision, as if he might need to abandon it all at a moment's notice. But hanging on pegs near the door, placed with the reverence some men reserved for religious artifacts, was the source of his fearsome reputation. The axe was a masterwork of deadly craftsmanship, its double-bladed head forged from steel that held the deep blue sheen of superior metalwork. The handle, worn smooth by years of use, bore subtle carvings that marked it as a weapon of rank, the kind carried only by Jarls or their most trusted champions. Asleif had seen that axe before, in the days when it was new and bright, before battle stains and years of exile had marked it with the patina of hard use. She remembered the day Jarl Magnus had presented it to his newest berserker, a ceremony that bound man to weapon and both to service that would leave neither unchanged. Bjornulf lifted the weapon from its pegs with the careful attention of a priest handling sacred objects. His massive hands, scarred from countless battles, closed around the familiar grip with the unconscious ease of long partnership. For a moment, Asleif saw the transformation begin, the awakening of something that had slept but never truly died. "Tell me," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority she remembered from the old days. It was the first time she had heard him speak more than the basic courtesies required for village life. "3 riders," she replied, matching his directness. "They came before dawn, destroyed my garden, took most of my goats, left tracks heading north toward the ridge country." She paused, then added what they both knew to be true. "They'll be back." Bjornulf nodded once. He moved to a wooden chest beneath the window and withdrew items that told the story of his forgotten profession. A mail shirt, links mended but still strong, leather braces reinforced with iron studs, a knife whose blade was shorter than the axe, but no less deadly in capable hands. "How many did you see clearly?" he asked, as he began the familiar ritual of preparation. 3 horses, 3 riders. But there could be more at their camp. Asleif settled into the room's single chair, recognizing that this conversation was following patterns established years ago in a different life. They were young, overconfident, the kind who think an old woman makes easy prey. As Bjornulf pulled the mail shirt over his head, Asleif saw him wince slightly. 7 years of peace had not erased the old wounds, merely allowed them to stiffen with age and inactivity. But as the familiar weight settled across his shoulders, something in his posture changed. The careful quiet of a man trying to disappear was replaced by the controlled stillness of a predator preparing to hunt. "You don't have to do this," Asleif said, though she knew the words were meaningless. "I could speak to the Jarl's men when they next come through. File a formal complaint." Bjornulf's laugh was a sound like grinding stone, "and they would arrive in spring, if at all. You know as well as I do what those raiders will do to you if they return and find you still here." The truth of it hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Raiders, who made their living from isolated farmsteads, were not known for leaving witnesses. An old woman alone represented not just easy plunder, but a loose end that needed cutting. "There is something else," Asleif said carefully. "The leader, the one who rode the black horse with the white blaze. I've seen him before." Bjornulf's hands stilled on the leather straps of his braces. "Where?" "At Magnus's court. 3 years ago, maybe 4. He was part of a delegation from the northern settlements. Complained about missing tribute, accused the Jarl's tax collectors of corruption." Asleif's voice carried the weight of memory and concern. "His name is Eriki Bloodbrow. He has a scar across his forehead from an old battle wound." The name meant nothing to Bjornulf, but the implications were clear. A man who had stood before Jarl Magnus was not some desperate outlaw living hand-to-mouth in the wilderness. This was someone with connections, with backing, possibly even with official sanction for his activities. "If he recognized you," Bjornulf said, testing the edge of his knife against his thumb, "then my troubles become much larger than a few stolen goats." Asleif finished. Yes, the morning sun had climbed high enough to send shafts of light through the single window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air between them. Outside, the sounds of village life continued, children's voices, the rhythmic thunk of axes splitting wood for winter storage, the distant calling of seabirds wheeling above the fjord. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the kind that would continue long after this day's violence was done. "I could leave," Asleif said quietly. "Take what I can carry, and seek shelter with relatives in the southern settlements." "Could you?" "Woke?" Bjornulf asked, his tone making clear that he already knew the answer. Asleif's silence was response enough. She was too old to start over, too attached to the land she had spent decades cultivating, too proud to arrive as a beggar at doors that might or might not open for her. And beneath all of that, too aware that running would solve nothing if Eriki Bloodbrow had indeed recognized her and understood what her presence in this remote place might mean. "Then we end it," Bjornulf said simply. He stood and moved toward the door, the axe hanging easily from his belt. "Tonight, when they return, they may not come back tonight," Asleif pointed out. "Raiders often strike and withdraw, then return days later when their victims have had time to despair. They'll come tonight." Bjornulf's certainty was absolute. They left deliberate destruction, not efficient theft. This Eriki wants you frightened, wants you to spend your day imagining what comes next. Men like that don't have the patience for a longer game. As they prepared to leave his dwelling, Asleif found herself studying the man she had once known as the most dangerous killer in Jarl Magnus's service. 7 years of exile had marked him. Lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and his shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with muscle and bone. But beneath the weariness, she could see the predator awakening. The part of him that had made kings sleep easier, knowing he served their interests. "There's something you should know," she said as they stepped into the afternoon light. "About why I never returned to Magnus's court after you left." Bjornulf paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Tell me." "The night you spoke your final words to the Jarl, when you said your soul was full and you could serve no more. I was in the antechamber, tending to a guard who had taken a blade in training. I heard everything that passed between you. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in single combat." Bjornulf turned to face her fully, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger, but a kind of resignation. "And?" he asked. "Magnus asked me, the next morning, if I had heard anything unusual the night before. He was testing me, seeing if his secret had been compromised." Asleif met his gaze steadily. "I told him I had heard nothing but the wind and the guard's complaints about the stitching. You lied to the Jarl. I protected a confidence. There's a difference." Asleif's voice carried the quiet dignity of someone who had made a choice and lived with its consequences. "But it cost me my position at court. Magnus never quite trusted me again, and I found it easier to retire to a place where old loyalties wouldn't be tested." Bjornulf absorbed this information with the stillness of a man accustomed to learning that the world was more complicated than it appeared. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note she hadn't heard since the old days: respect, mixed with something that might have been gratitude. "Then we both have debts to settle," he said. As they walked through the village toward her destroyed farmstead, Asleif felt the weight of years beginning to lift from her shoulders. For the first time since dawn, she was not facing her troubles alone. Beside her walked a man who had once been death incarnate and who was about to remember what that meant. The sun reached its zenith as they arrived at Asleif's farmstead, casting sharp shadows that made the destruction seem even more deliberate and cruel. In daylight, the full scope of the raiders' work became clear. This had not been the hurried pillaging of desperate men, but a calculated campaign of intimidation designed to break an old woman's spirit before they returned to finish what they had started. Bjornulf moved through the wreckage with the methodical attention of a hunter reading sign. He knelt beside the destroyed herb garden, his fingers tracing patterns in the churned earth that told stories invisible to untrained eyes. 3 horses, as Asleif had said, but the depth and spacing of the hoofprints revealed more than mere numbers. "The black horse carries the heaviest rider," he said, pointing to a set of impressions near what had been her prized collection of healing sage. "Your Eriki Bloodbrow. The bay is nervous, shies from shadows, young horse or young rider. The grey is old, steady, carries a man who knows his business but doesn't need to prove it." Asleif watched him work with the fascination of someone seeing a master craftsman return to familiar tools. The years fell away as Bjornulf's training reasserted itself, transforming him from village outcast to something far more dangerous. "They spent time here," he continued, moving toward the collapsed gate, "not just smashing and grabbing. They were looking for something specific. What could raiders want besides food and animals?" Asleif asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Information." Bjornulf straightened, his gaze sweeping across the farmstead with new understanding. "They went through your stores carefully. See here." He pointed to scattered grain sacks near the storage shed. "They opened these with knives, not axes. They were reading what you had, calculating what you could spare. The implications settled between them like winter ice. Raiders interested in immediate plunder would have taken what they could carry and burned the rest. These men had been conducting an assessment, determining exactly how much wealth Asleif possessed and how vulnerable she truly was. "They know you live alone," Bjornulf said. "They know you have no male relatives to call for help. They know you're too far from the village for anyone to hear you scream." His voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had planned similar operations from the other side. This was reconnaissance. Asleif felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "You think they'll come in force? I think Eriki Bloodbrow is more than he appears to be." Bjornulf moved to the tree line that bordered her property, studying the ground where the raiders had waited and watched before making their move. "Look at this." He pointed to a series of marks in the soft earth beneath an oak tree. Someone had drawn diagrams in the dirt with a stick, rough sketches that showed the layout of her buildings, the position of her animal pens, even the location of her well. "They mapped your defenses," he said, "such as they are." Asleif joined him beneath the tree, studying the crude drawings that reduced her life's work to a tactical problem. "How long do you think they watched?" "Long enough to know your routines. When you wake, when you tend the animals, when you work in the garden." Bjornulf's finger traced the sketched lines that represented her daily path, from house to barn to herb plots. "They know you're strongest in the morning, move slower as the day wears on. They know you keep a walking stick by the door, but no weapons." The thoroughness of their surveillance was more terrifying than the actual destruction. To know that she had been watched, studied, reduced to a collection of habits and weaknesses, while she went about her daily life in blissful ignorance, it was a violation that cut deeper than mere theft. "There's something else," Bjornulf said, his voice taking on the grim tone she remembered from the old days when he would report to Jarl Magnus after completing a mission. They left a message. He led her to the back of her storage shed, where the raiders had carved symbols into the weathered wood. Not random vandalism, but deliberate communication, 3 interconnected circles above a horizontal line with runic letters scratched beneath. The mark of the Iron Ravens. Asleif breathed, recognizing the symbol from her days at court. "Magnus banned that brotherhood years ago." "Banned but not destroyed," Bjornulf replied. "They went underground, became sellswords and raiders. But they kept their loyalty to each other and their hatred for the Jarl who cast them out. The Iron Ravens had been a brotherhood of warriors who served various Jarls across the northern territories, bound by oaths that transcended individual loyalties. When internal conflicts arose, they had refused to fight against each other, choosing exile over fraternal bloodshed. Jarl Magnus had declared them outlaws, claiming their divided loyalties made them dangerous to the stability of the realm. "If Eriki serves the Iron Ravens now," Asleif said slowly, "then this isn't about a few stolen goats." "No," Bjornulf agreed, "this is about you. About what you know and who you served." They stood in the shadow of the shed, staring at symbols that transformed a simple raid into something far more complex and dangerous. Asleif felt the weight of old secrets pressing down on her, memories she had tried to bury beneath years of quiet rural life. "There are things I never told you," she said finally, "about the night you left Magnus's service, about what happened after." Bjornulf waited, his patience as vast and still as a mountain lake. "The guard I was treating, the one who gave me an excuse to be in the antechamber, his wound wasn't from training. It was from a knife fight in the lower city. A fight that started when he was overheard talking about Magnus's private business." Asleif's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Someone was paying for information about the Jarl's activities, about his special assignments. Who? I never learned. But Magnus suspected the Iron Ravens were involved, that they were gathering intelligence about his methods, his agents, his vulnerabilities. She met his eyes. That guard died 2 days later. Officially, his wound became infected despite my care. Unofficially, Magnus silenced him, Bjornulf finished, and began questioning everyone who had contact with him, including me. Asleif wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the afternoon warmth. That's when he tested my loyalty, when he asked what I had heard the night you resigned. I think he suspected I knew more than I was saying. Did you? The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Asleif considered her answer carefully, aware that truth spoken now could change everything between them. I knew that someone was hunting your secrets, she said at last. I knew that Magnus was eliminating anyone who might betray them, and I knew that if I admitted to overhearing your conversation, I would join that guard in an early grave. Bjornulf absorbed this revelation with the stillness that had always marked his most dangerous moods. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man accepting an unwelcome truth. So you protected both our secrets by claiming ignorance, and made myself a liability in the process, Asleif replied. Someone who knew too much but claimed to know nothing. The kind of loose thread that eventually gets pulled. The afternoon shadows were lengthening now, and with them came the knowledge that their time for preparation was growing short. Somewhere in the hills north of her farmstead, Iriki Bloodbrow and his Iron Ravens were making their own preparations, planning their return. With the confidence of hunters who believed they had cornered helpless prey, they had no idea that their prey had teeth. As the afternoon wore toward evening, Bjornulf began transforming Asleif's farmstead from a place of peaceful cultivation into something altogether more deadly. His movements held the efficiency of a man who had performed this particular dance many times before, turning the familiar terrain into a killing ground that would serve his purposes when darkness fell. They'll come from the north ridge, he said, pointing toward the tree-covered slope that overlooked her property. It gives them the best view of the buildings and multiple escape routes if things go wrong. Asleif watched him work with growing unease. This was not the broken exile who had lived quietly on the edge of their village for 7 years. This was the man who had once been Jarl Magnus's most trusted killer, and the transformation was as complete as it was terrifying. The moon will be dark. Tonight, she observed, settling on a stump to rest her aging bones. They'll have that advantage. Darkness serves the prepared better than the confident, Bjornulf replied, testing the tension on a rope he had strung between 2 posts. At waist height, nearly invisible in the growing shadows, it would send a charging horse tumbling and leave its rider broken on the hard ground. He had already prepared 3 such traps, positioned to channel attackers into predetermined paths where his axe could find them most easily. The careful placement spoke of experience earned in harder schools than most men ever attended. You've done this before, Asleif said. It was not a question. Many times. Bjornulf paused in his work, his hands still on the rope. Magnus had enemies who preferred striking at night, who thought darkness made them invisible. I taught them otherwise. There was something in his voice, a flatness that spoke of deeds done and never discussed, that made Asleif remember why she had sometimes found it difficult to meet his eyes in the old days. She had tended his wounds and never asked how he came by them. She had seen him return from missions with blood on his clothes that was not his own and had simply provided hot water and clean rags without comment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "The path you chose?" Bjornulf continued his work for several heartbeats before answering. "I regret the necessity of it. I regret that men like Magnus need men like me. I regret that the world is cruel enough to reward what I was good at." He straightened, meeting her gaze across the farmyard. "But I don't regret serving a lord who used my skills to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." It was perhaps the longest speech she had heard from him since his arrival in Frosvik. and it revealed depths she had only guessed at during their brief interactions at court. Beneath the killer's efficiency lay something that might have been a conscience, battered and scarred, but not entirely destroyed. "The Iron Ravens will see this differently," she said. "To them, you were Magnus's pet monster, the reason their brotherhood was disbanded and their members scattered. Let them think what they will." Bjornulf began checking his weapons with the ritualistic care of a priest preparing for sacred ceremony. "They chose exile over duty. I chose duty until it broke me. Neither path leads to clean hands." As full darkness approached, they settled into position behind the stone wall that surrounded Asleif's well. From there, they could see the approach from the north ridge while remaining hidden from casual observation. Bjornulf had insisted she wear his mail shirt, arguing that her knowledge was more valuable than his life, a claim she disputed but could not convince him to abandon. The metal links felt strange against her aged body, heavier than she remembered from the few times she had helped wounded warriors remove their armor. But there was comfort in the weight as well, a sense of protection that went beyond the physical. She was no longer a helpless old woman waiting to be victimized. She was a veteran of Magnus's court, prepared to fight for what was hers. "Tell me about the night you left," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the evening wind through the trees. "What finally broke your willingness to serve?" Bjornulf was silent for so long that she began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession long held back. "There was a girl," he said, 12 years old, maybe 13. Daughter of a merchant, Magnus, suspected of selling information to his enemies. The suspicion was probably correct. The man was weak and greedy, the kind who would sell his mother for silver if the price was right. Asleif felt her blood grow cold. She had heard whispers of such missions, tasks that were spoken of only in the most indirect terms, even among Magnus's inner circle. "Magnus wanted an example made," Bjornulf continued, "something that would discourage others from similar betrayals. The merchant was easy enough. A knife in an alley, another casualty of the lower city's random violence. But Magnus wanted his family to understand the consequences of treachery. The girl," Asleif whispered, "was innocent of her father's crimes. Young enough that she might have grown up to be something better than what her bloodline suggested." Bjornulf's hands tightened on his axe handle. "I stood outside her bedroom window for half the night, listening to her sleep, trying to convince myself that duty required her death. But you couldn't do it. I told Magnus that raiders had taken her, that I found only blood and signs of struggle. He accepted the lie because he trusted my efficiency." Bjornulf's voice dropped to barely audible levels. "I gave her money and put her on a ship bound for the western settlements, told her never to return or speak her true name to anyone. The confession hung between them like incense in a temple, sacred and terrible in its honesty." Asleif reached out and placed her weathered hand over his scarred knuckles, offering what comfort she could to a man who had carried this burden alone for years. "That was the night you told Magnus your soul was full," she said. "That was the night I learned there were some orders I could not follow, no matter the cost." Bjornulf turned his hand palm up, accepting her touch. "It was also the night I realized that a man who cannot kill a child for the sake of duty is a man who can no longer be trusted with such duties." From somewhere in the darkness beyond the ridge, an owl called, a sound that might have been natural or might have been a signal between men who hunted in the night. Bjornulf tensed, his hand moving to his axe with the unconscious readiness of long training. "They're coming," he whispered, and in the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the soft sound of hoofbeats moving carefully through the darkness toward them. The night air carried more than the sound of approaching hooves. It brought the metallic scent of weapons recently oiled, the leather and sweat smell of men who lived rough, and something else, a tension that spoke of violence held barely in check. Bjornulf's nostrils flared as he read the night like a scroll written in familiar languages. 3 horses, as expected, he whispered to Asleif, his voice barely disturbing the air between them. But they're moving wrong. Too careful, too coordinated. These aren't simple raiders drunk on their own boldness. From their position behind the stone, well, they watched shadows detach themselves from the greater darkness of the ridge. The riders had dismounted and were leading their horses, approaching on foot with a patience that spoke of military training rather than casual banditry. "Eriki learned his business in someone's army," Bjornulf observed, tracking the lead figure as he ghosted between patches of moonlight. "Look at how they move, proper spacing, hand signals, designated roles. This is how soldiers approach a fortified position." The realization sent ice through Asleif's veins. She had hoped, despite everything, that this might still be resolved through negotiation or intimidation. Men who moved with such discipline were not likely to be dissuaded by threats or bargains. The lead figure, Eriki Bloodbrow, she was certain, recognizing his distinctive gait, even in the darkness, raised his hand in a gesture that froze his companions. For long moments, the 3 raiders studied the farmstead with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. "They're looking for signs that you've fled," Bjornulf explained, his breath warm against her ear. "Checking for smoke from the chimney, lights in the windows, any indication that you're still here or have abandoned the place." Asleif had followed his instructions precisely, leaving her dwelling exactly as it would appear if she had gone about her normal evening routine before retiring for the night. A single candle flickered in the main room, visible through windows deliberately left uncovered. Embers glowed in the hearth, sending thin smoke into the night air. To casual observation, an old woman slept peacefully within, unaware of the danger gathering outside her door. "The young one is nervous," Bjornulf continued his commentary, pointing to the smallest of the 3 figures. "See how he keeps checking his weapons, how his head moves too quickly. First time doing wet work, most likely. That makes him dangerous in unpredictable ways." The 3rd raider, the one Bjornulf had identified as experienced from his horse's steady temperament, moved with the fluid economy of a veteran. He carried himself like a man comfortable with violence, neither eager for it nor afraid of it, simply accepting it as another tool to be used when circumstances required. "That one's killed before," Asleif said, recognizing something in the man's posture that reminded her of the harder members of Magnus's household guard. "Many times," Bjornulf agreed, "but always with overwhelming advantage. Men like that grow careless when they think they face no real opposition." Eriki made another hand signal, and the 3 figures separated with the precision of a well-rehearsed maneuver. The nervous young raider moved toward the animal pens, probably tasked with gathering any livestock that might have escaped the previous night's attention. The veteran approached the main dwelling from the side, keeping to shadows and moving with predatory patience. Eriki himself advanced directly toward the front door, his confidence evident in every step. "They expect to find you asleep and helpless," Bjornulf whispered. "The young one will secure the perimeter while the other 2 enter your home. Standard procedure for this kind of work." "What kind of work?" Asleif asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Elimination of a security risk," Bjornulf replied, with the flat certainty of someone who had performed such tasks himself. "They're not here to rob you again. They're here to ensure you never speak of what you've seen or what you might know." The young raider reached the animal pens and began his search, moving with the jerky quickness of barely controlled nerves. He found the 2 remaining goats and made the mistake that Bjornulf had been counting on. He opened the gate to drive them out, triggering the carefully positioned snare that sent him sprawling into the mud with a startled cry. The sound shattered the night's quiet like a stone through glass. Both Eriki and the veteran froze, their heads turning toward their fallen companion. In that moment of distraction, Bjornulf rose from behind the stone well, like a vengeful spirit emerging from the earth itself. The veteran saw him first and opened his mouth to shout a warning, But Bjornulf was already moving with the terrifying speed that had once made him the most feared killer in 3 kingdoms. The distance between the well and the side of the house disappeared beneath his feet as if it had never existed. The veteran had time to draw his sword halfway from its sheath before Bjornulf's axe took him in the side with the sound of an iron bell struck by lightning. The man folded around the wound with a wet gasp, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers as his life poured out onto the ground. Eriki spun toward the sound of his companion's death, his own blade appearing in his hand with the fluid grace of long practice. But instead of charging toward the combat, he called out in a voice that carried clearly across the farmyard, "Bjornulf Ironhand, I know you're there. I know who you are and what you've done." The words stopped Bjornulf's advance as effectively as a physical barrier. He stood over the veteran's corpse, axe dripping in the corpticide, moonlight, and faced the man who had dared speak his true name in a place where he had hoped it was forgotten. "Come out where I can see you, properly," Eriki continued, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he held the superior position. "We have much to discuss, you and I, about old debts and older loyalties, about the price Magnus put on your head when he learned what you really did with that merchant's daughter." Asleif felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Behind the stone well, she pressed herself deeper into the shadows, understanding that the game had changed completely. This was no longer about stolen goats, or even about silencing a potential witness. This was about hunting the most dangerous man alive and collecting a bounty that would set the Iron Ravens up for life. "You thought Magnus believed your lies about raiders," Eriki called out, beginning to circle toward where Bjornulf stood motionless in the moonlight. "You thought your secret died with him. But the Iron Ravens have long memories and patient hearts. We know what you did. We know why you really left his service. And we know what that knowledge is worth to the right people." The young raider was climbing to his feet near the animal pens, shaking off the effects of his fall and reaching for the horn at his belt, a signal device that would bring reinforcements from wherever the Iron Ravens were camped. But before he could raise the instrument to his lips, an arrow sprouted from his throat with a wet thunk, sending him tumbling backward into the mud he had only just escaped. From the darkness beyond the farmstead's boundaries, new voices called out in the tongue of Magnus's household guard. The Jarl had arrived. The arrival of Magnus's warriors transformed the farmstead into something resembling a battlefield from the old sagas, where heroes and villains faced each other beneath stars that had witnessed countless such confrontations. Torches blazed to life around the perimeter as armed figures emerged from concealment with the disciplined efficiency of professional soldiers. Eriki Bloodbrow found himself surrounded, but his reaction spoke of a man who had faced such situations before. Instead of panic or desperate flight, he straightened his shoulders and adjusted his grip on his sword, settling into a fighting stance that acknowledged his circumstances without accepting defeat. "Jarl Magnus," he called out to the darkness beyond the torchlight. "I should have expected you to follow your lost dog's scent eventually." From the shadows stepped a figure that commanded attention through presence alone, even before his features became visible in the flickering light. Magnus the Stern had earned his epithet through 40 years of rule that brooked no defiance and forgave no betrayal, but the man who emerged into the farmyard's illumination showed the weight of those decades in every measured step. His hair had gone completely silver. In the 7 years since Bjornulf had last seen him, and new lines marked his face like battle scars earned in conflicts with time itself. But his eyes retained the glacier blue intensity that had made him one of the most feared Jarls in the northern territories, and his hand rested on a sword that had drunk deeply from the wells of his enemies' lives. "Eriki Bloodbrow," Magnus replied, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power, tempered by genuine weariness. "Still alive, despite your best efforts to change that circumstance. Still serving masters who pay you to clean up messes they lack the courage to handle themselves. The Iron Ravens serve no masters but our own brotherhood," Eriki shot back, though his eyes continued to track the movements of Magnus's guards as they tightened their circle around him. The Iron Ravens serve whoever pays them enough silver to ignore their supposed principles, Magnus corrected. Just as you served me, once upon a time, before you decided that personal honor was more valuable than duty to your sworn lord. Bjornulf remained motionless throughout this exchange, his axe still dripping with the veteran raider's blood, his attention divided between the immediate threat of Eriki's blade and the larger question of why Magnus had appeared at this remote farmstead at precisely the right moment. "You followed us," Bjornulf said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had begun to see the shape of the trap that had been set around him. "I followed reports," Magnus replied, turning to face his former berserker with an expression that mixed old affection with new caution. "Reports of questions being asked about my former agents, of old secrets being dug up by men who thought the past could be weaponized against the present." Asleif rose slowly from behind the stone well, the borrowed mail shirt glinting in the torchlight as she stepped into the open. Her movement drew every eye in the farmyard, and she saw recognition kindle in Magnus's gaze. Not surprise, but confirmation of suspicions long held. "My lord," she said, offering the formal acknowledgement due to his rank while making no move to approach him. "It has been many years." "Not nearly enough, I think," Magnus replied. "I had hoped that exile would prove sufficient to ensure your silence about matters that were never your concern. And yet here you stand in my farmyard, suggesting that my silence was never the real issue." Asleif responded with the dignity of someone who had served in royal courts and would not be intimidated by threats, however subtly delivered. Eriki Bloodbrow laughed, a sound like grinding millstones that drew attention back to his precarious position at the center of the armed circle. "Look at this reunion of old conspirators. The Jarl who orders killings but keeps his own hands clean, the healer who tends wounds but never asks how they were earned, and the berserker who finally grew a conscience and thought he could simply walk away from what he had done." "What do you want, Eriki?" Magnus asked, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Silver? Land? Safe passage to territories beyond my reach? Name your price for ending this foolishness before it escalates beyond control." "I want justice," Eriki replied, his sword point never wavering from Bjornulf's direction. "I want acknowledgement of crimes committed in darkness and paid for in blood that was never your own." "Whose blood?" Bjornulf asked quietly, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "The merchant's daughter," Eriki said with the satisfaction of a man delivering a killing blow. "Sweet little Sigrid, who you claimed was taken by raiders, who you put on a ship to the western settlements with enough gold to start a new life far from her father's sins." The words fell into the farmyard like stones into still water, sending ripples of understanding and horror outward from their impact. Magnus's expression shifted from wariness to something approaching genuine surprise, while Asleif felt pieces of a puzzle she had never fully understood suddenly clicking into place. "She never reached the western settlements," Eriki continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a formal accusation. "The ship was attacked by real raiders 2 days out of port. Everyone aboard was killed, their cargo taken, their bodies left for the fish and the seabirds." Bjornulf's axe trembled in his grip, and for a moment Asleif feared he might collapse under the weight of this revelation. The child he had tried to save, whose life had cost him his position and his peace, had died anyway, killed by the very forces he had tried to protect her from. "You couldn't have known," Magnus said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been sympathy. "The raiders struck without warning. There was no way to predict." "There was every way to predict it," Eriki interrupted, "because those raiders were Iron Ravens, acting on information I provided about a merchant ship carrying more gold than its size would suggest." The confession hit the farmyard like a physical blow. Magnus's hand tightened on his sword hilt, while his guards shifted restlessly, awaiting orders that had not yet come. Bjornulf raised his head to stare at Eriki with eyes that had gone completely dead, the look of a man who had just learned that his greatest mercy had become his greatest failure. "You killed her," Bjornulf said, his voice barely audible. "You killed the child I tried to save." "I killed a loose thread," Eriki corrected, "just as I'm here to kill another one. The girl's death was simply a bonus, proof that your conscience was as worthless as your loyalty." The farmyard fell silent except for the crackling of torches and the distant sound of wind through the trees. In that silence, old debts and older loyalties faced each other across ground that had been watered with too much blood, and everyone present understood that some conversations could only end one way. The silence stretched like a blade drawn across throat, and in that terrible quiet, Magnus did something that stunned everyone present. He sheathed his sword and stepped back from the armed circle, his hands visible and empty, his posture that of a man laying down authority rather than asserting it. "Lower your weapons," he commanded his guards, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "All of you, this ends now." "My lord?" The captain of his guard, a grizzled veteran named Orm, looked at Magnus as if the Jarl had suddenly begun speaking in tongues. "The Iron Raven is still armed, still dangerous." "The Iron Raven is telling the truth," Magnus said quietly. "And that truth changes everything I thought I knew about loyalty, justice, and the price of the choices I have made." Eriki's sword wavered slightly, confusion replacing the battle-ready focus that had marked his stance since the confrontation began. "What game is this, Magnus? What new deception are you weaving?" "No game, no deception." Magnus turned to face Bjornulf fully, and Asleif saw something in the Jarl's expression she had never witnessed before, genuine remorse, mixed with a grief that seemed to come from his very bones. "I need to tell you about the night you left my service, about what happened after you walked away." Bjornulf's grip on his axe tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I know what happened. I broke faith with you, broke my oath, chose personal conscience over duty. You had every right to declare me outlaw." "I never declared you outlaw," Magnus said, the words falling like hammer blows on anvil steel. "I never sent hunters after you. I never put a price on your head." He paused, seeming to gather strength for what came next. "Because 3 days after you left, I learned the truth about that merchant and his daughter. The farmyard had become a place where time itself seemed suspended, where the normal laws of cause and effect waited on the revelation of secrets that had shaped lives and deaths for 7 long years. The merchant was innocent," Magnus continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke words he had clearly carried for too long. "The information he was accused of selling to my enemies, it came from within my own household. From someone I trusted completely, someone who used his access to my private affairs to feed intelligence to the Iron Ravens." Eriki's face had gone pale in the torchlight, and his sword point dropped toward the ground as understanding began to dawn in his eyes. "Who?" Bjornulf asked, though something in his tone suggested he was beginning to guess. "Hakon, the Wise," Magnus said, naming his former chief advisor, a man whose counsel had shaped policy for nearly 2 decades. "My most trusted counselor, the man I relied on for guidance in matters both large and small. He had been feeding information to the Iron Ravens for years, building a case against me that would eventually be used to justify my removal from power." Asleif felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Hakon had been present during many of her conversations with Magnus, had known about the guard's wound and the circumstances surrounding it, had been positioned to manipulate the Jarl's suspicions about anyone who might threaten the carefully laid plans for rebellion. "The merchant was killed to cover Hakon's tracks," Magnus continued. "An innocent man murdered to protect the real traitor's identity. And his daughter," his voice broke slightly, "she was never supposed to die at all. Hakon told me she had been safely relocated, claimed it was a mercy to let the child believe her father had simply disappeared rather than been executed for treason. But she was on that ship," Eriki said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ship I told my brothers to raid, because Hakon arranged for her to be there," Magnus replied. "He knew about your plans to attack merchant vessels. He made sure she would be aboard a ship that was sailing into an ambush, ensuring that the last witness to her father's innocence would be permanently silenced." The revelation hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Bjornulf staggered slightly, the weight of 7 years of self-recrimination suddenly lifting from his shoulders, only to be replaced by a rage so pure and cold that it seemed to draw warmth from the very air around him. "Hakon knew I had spared her," he said, his voice carrying the deadly quiet that had once marked his most dangerous moods. "He knew, and he used that knowledge to eliminate her while making it appear to be coincidence. More than that," Magnus said, "he used your mercy to destroy your relationship with me. He suggested that your refusal to complete the mission was a sign that you could no longer be trusted, that your loyalties had been compromised. He convinced me that letting you go was the wisest course, that keeping you close would only lead to greater betrayals." Asleif stepped forward, her mind racing through implications that reached far beyond personal vendettas. If Hakon was feeding information to the Iron Ravens for years, then he knew about all of your operations. Every mission, every target, every secret that passed through your halls, including the locations of agents who had served me faithfully and then sought peaceful retirement, Magnus confirmed, his gaze settling on her with something that might have been apology. "I never sent anyone after you, Asleif, but I couldn't protect you if I didn't know you were in danger." "Then how did you know to come here tonight?" Bjornulf demanded. Magnus gestured to Orm, who stepped forward and placed a leather satchel on the ground between them. From it, he withdrew a collection of documents, letters written in a careful hand, maps marked with locations, and lists of names that made Asleif's blood run cold. "We captured one of Hakon's agents last month," Magnus explained. "A man who was carrying orders to eliminate every surviving witness to my former operations. Your names were both on that list, along with locations where you could be found and suggestions for how your deaths should appear accidental." Eriki was staring at the documents as if they were venomous serpents. "These orders, they came through Iron Raven channels. Hakon was still using our network even after your supposed victory over our brotherhood. Because the Iron Ravens were never truly broken," Magnus said. "They were simply redirected to serve Hakon's purposes rather than their own. He needed you scattered and desperate enough to accept any commission that paid well, even if it meant killing innocents." The truth that emerged from these revelations was more terrible than simple betrayal. For 7 years, all of them had been dancing to music played by a man who had orchestrated their separation, their suffering, their mutual mistrust. Bjornulf had lived in exile, believing himself a traitor to his oath. Asleif had hidden in remote isolation, believing herself marked for death by her former lord. Eriki had served a conspiracy, believing himself to be fighting against corruption while actually enabling it. And through it all, Hakon had grown stronger, using the chaos he had created to position himself as the power behind multiple thrones, the invisible hand that guided kingdoms toward conflicts that served his ultimate vision of control. "Where is he now?" Bjornulf asked, and in those 4 words, everyone present heard the promise of retribution that had been 7 years in the making. "That," Magnus said, "is what we need to discuss. Because Hakon is no longer content to work from shadows. 3 days ago, he declared himself Jarl of the Eastern Reaches and announced his intention to unite all the northern territories under his rule. Through conquest?" Asleif asked. "Through revelation of secrets," Magnus replied grimly. "He claims to possess evidence of corruption and betrayal among every Jarl in the north. Evidence that could topple kingdoms and destroy lives. Evidence gathered through decades of patient manipulation and carefully orchestrated treachery." Eriki slowly raised his sword again, But this time, its point was aimed not at Bjornulf, but toward the darkness beyond the farmstead, toward the distant halls where their true enemy waited with the patience of a spider at the center of its web. "Then we end him," the Iron Raven said simply. And for the first time in 7 years, sworn enemies found themselves in complete agreement. The war council that formed around Asleif's farmyard bore little resemblance to the formal gatherings of Magnus's court. Here, beneath a sky pregnant with winter storms and lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on weathered faces, former enemies shared intelligence with the grim efficiency of veterans who understood that survival depended on putting aside old grudges. Magnus had brought more than just guards on his journey north. From the darkness beyond the farmstead emerged men whose faces Bjornulf recognized from his years of service, Thorek the scout, whose ability to read terrain had saved countless lives, Gunnar Ironwill, the siege master whose engineering skills had breached fortifications that others thought impregnable, and Eric Stormcrow, whose network of spies and informants stretched across the northern territories like an invisible web. "Hakon has fortified the old mountain stronghold at Ravenscroft," Magnus began, spreading a detailed map across a makeshift table formed from overturned crates. 3 days, hard riding from here, built into the cliff face where siege engines cannot reach and assault forces must climb, exposed rock under constant arrow fire. Bjornulf studied the map with the eye of a man who had once specialized in impossible missions. The fortress was indeed formidable, positioned on a narrow shelf of stone that commanded views of all approaches. A single winding path led to the main gate, overlooked by multiple defensive positions that could rain death on attackers from 3 different elevations. "How many men does he have?" Iriki asked, his earlier hostility replaced by professional interest. The Iron Raven might have served corrupt masters, but his military expertise remained sharp. 200 sworn warriors, Thorek replied, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had counted the enemy personally. Plus another 100 auxiliaries, men from the local settlements who serve more from fear than loyalty. And the stronghold itself. Provisions for a year-long siege, fresh water from mountain springs that cannot be cut off, and armories stocked with weapons enough to outfit an army twice that size. Eric Stormcrow's intelligence was thorough and depressing in its implications. He has been planning this for longer than any of us suspected. Asleif moved closer to the map, her healer's knowledge of anatomy translating into an understanding of defensive structures that surprised the assembled warriors. "Here," she said, pointing to a section of the fortress that appeared blank on the drawing. "There should be waste disposal systems, ventilation for the lower levels. No fortress is built without ways to remove what cannot be stored." Magnus nodded approvingly. "The old siege tunnels were sealed decades ago, but you're right about the necessities. Every stronghold has vulnerabilities that builders try to hide but cannot eliminate. I know those tunnels," Eriki said quietly, his scarred face thoughtful in the torchlight. "The Iron Ravens used Ravenscroft as a meeting place before Magnus disbanded us. Hakon arranged our access through forgotten passages that bypassed the main defenses." "Forgotten by whom?" Bjornulf asked, sensing opportunity in the iron. "Raven's words. By everyone except the men who built them," Eriki replied. "The original architects created multiple hidden entrances for emergencies, ways for defenders to escape if the main fortress fell, or for reinforcements to enter unseen during siege conditions." Gunnar Ironwill leaned forward with the intensity of a craftsman recognizing superior work. "Those passages would be narrow, defensible at multiple points, probably trapped against unauthorized use. Even knowing they exist doesn't make them practical for assault. Unless you have someone who helped design the traps," Eriki said with a bitter smile. "Hakon trusted me with more than just military intelligence. He shared architectural secrets, showed me the hidden mechanisms that could seal passages or flood them with burning oil. He wanted the Iron Ravens to be able to access Ravenscroft whenever his plans required our services." Magnus absorbed this information with the satisfaction of a commander who had just discovered that the impossible mission might merely be improbable. Could you still navigate those passages, find your way to the heart of the fortress without raising alarms? I could, Eriki confirmed, but not alone. The passages are designed for small groups, no more than 3 or 4 men moving in single file. And once inside, we would face the same problem that has protected Hakon all these years. He surrounds himself with absolutely loyal guards who will die before allowing harm to reach him. How loyal? Asleif asked, remembering the dynamics of court politics from her years in Magnus's service. Bound by more than oaths, Eric Stormcrow replied grimly. Hakon holds their families as honored guests in the fortress, wives and children who live in comfort as long as their husbands remain faithful. Hostages disguised as dependents, but hostages nonetheless. The revelation cast a shadow over their planning that went beyond mere tactical concerns. Fighting men who served from fear was one thing. Fighting men who knew their families would die if they wavered was something altogether different. Such defenders would not break and run when the battle turned against them. They would fight with the desperate fury of men who had everything to lose and nothing to gain from surrender. There is another way, Bjornulf said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had begun to see the shape of a solution that others might find unthinkable. Hakon expects treachery, expects his enemies to come at him through violence and force. He has prepared for siege, for assault, for every conventional approach to warfare. What are you thinking? Magnus asked, though something in his tone suggested he was beginning to guess. He has not prepared for justice, Bjornulf replied. For a formal challenge issued according to the old laws, witnessed by those who remember how such things were done before politics corrupted honor. The suggestion fell into the war, counsel like a stone into still water, sending ripples of consideration and doubt outward from its impact. Single combat as a resolution to disputes was ancient tradition, but it had fallen from favor as kingdoms grew larger and conflicts became more complex. Few men alive remembered the proper forms, and fewer still possessed the authority to issue challenges that could not be ignored. Hakon would never accept, Eriki said immediately. He gains nothing from personal combat and risks everything. Why would he abandon the advantages of position and numbers for the uncertainty of individual skill? Because he cannot refuse a challenge issued in the presence of his own sworn men, Magnus replied, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. The old laws bind Jarls as well as warriors. To refuse formal combat when properly challenged is to forfeit all claim to leadership, all right to command loyalty. But who has the authority to issue such a challenge? Gunnar asked. It must come from someone whose rank equals Hakon's claim to authority, someone whose honor is unquestioned. All eyes turned to Magnus, but the Jarl shook his head slowly. Not me. I have too much history with Hakon. Too many old grudges that would make this seem like personal revenge rather than justice. He paused, his gaze moving from face to face around the makeshift council table. It must come from someone whose only interest is in seeing truth prevail over deception. Asleif, Bjornulf said quietly, and the others turned to stare at the elderly healer as if seeing her clearly for the first time. A woman cannot issue such challenges, Thorek protested, his military mind struggling with concepts that transcended conventional warfare. A woman cannot. Asleif agreed. But a former member of the Jarl's household, someone who served justice before serving any individual ruler, someone whose testimony about past events could not be disputed, such a person might have standing under the oldest laws. Magnus nodded slowly, pieces of a desperate plan beginning to take shape in his mind. You were present for many of Hakon's betrayals, witnessed his manipulations firsthand. Your testimony could provide the legal foundation for a formal accusation of treason. And once accused, he must answer or forfeit his position, Eric Stormcrow added, his spy's knowledge of legal precedent proving valuable in unexpected ways. The old laws are clear on this point. A Jarl who will not defend his honor in combat has no right to rule others. But who fights for justice if I issue the challenge? Asleif asked. I am too old, too weak to face a man in his prime. A champion may answer for the accuser, Bjornulf said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had found his path at last. Someone who serves not personal interest, but the cause of truth itself. The War Council fell silent as the implications of this plan settled over them like morning mist. It was audacious beyond measure, dependent on legal technicalities that had not been invoked for generations, and it placed the entire resolution of their conflict on the outcome of single combat between two men whose skills had been forged in very different schools of violence. Hakon is no warrior, Magnus said finally. He has always preferred manipulation to direct confrontation, politics to personal combat, but he is cunning, and he will not enter such a contest without advantages of his own. Let him bring whatever advantages he thinks he needs, Bjornulf replied, his hand moving unconsciously to the grip of his axe. 7 years I have lived with the knowledge that a child died because of choices I made. 7 years I have carried the weight of believing myself a traitor to everything I once served. If Hakon wishes to test himself against justice, armed with nothing but cunning and treachery, I will be happy to provide that education. As the first light of dawn began to touch the system, eastern horizon, the most unlikely alliance in the history of the Northern Territories prepared to march against an enemy who had manipulated them all, armed with nothing more than an ancient law, a desperate plan, and the terrible fury of men who had finally learned the true identity of their tormentor. The game that Hakon the Wise had played for so long was about to face its final move, and the stakes could not be higher. The approach to Ravenscroft Fortress unfolded like a lesson in the futility of conventional warfare. 3 days of hard riding through increasingly treacherous mountain passes had brought Magnus's small force to the base of cliffs that rose like the walls of the world itself, black stone gleaming with ice, and offering no mercy to those who sought to climb them without invitation. Bjornulf studied the ancient stronghold through eyes that had learned to see death in stone and timber, measuring distances and calculating odds with the grim precision of someone who understood that this might be his last battlefield. The fortress squatted on its shelf of rock like a predatory bird, every line of its construction designed to funnel attackers into killing grounds where numbers meant nothing and courage served only to ensure a heroic death. Even with the secret passages, this is madness, Thorek murmured, his scouts' training making him acutely aware of how exposed they were on the narrow trail that switchbacked up the mountain face. A dozen archers could hold those paths against an army, which is why we're not attacking, Magnus reminded him, though his own voice carried undertones of doubt. We're making a formal approach under the old laws, seeking audience for the presentation of legal challenges. Eriki had shed his Iron Raven colors in favor of a plain cloak that would not immediately mark him as an enemy, but his hand never strayed far from his sword hilt as they climbed toward the gates that had once welcomed him as an ally. Hakon will know why we've come before we speak a word, he said quietly. His spies have been watching us since we left the farmstead. Let him watch, Asleif replied, with the dignity of someone who had faced kings and found them merely men with more responsibilities than wisdom. Let him see exactly who comes to demand justice from him. The main gate of Ravenscroft opened as they approached, but not in welcome. Armed guards emerged with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers, their weapons held ready but not quite threatening. At their head walked a man Bjornulf recognized from the old days, Captain Ulf Grimson, who had once served Magnus before transferring his loyalty to the advisor who had gradually accumulated more real power than his nominal lord. Jarl Magnus, Ulf called out, his voice echoing from the stone walls with formal courtesy that barely concealed watchful tension. You honor Ravenscroft with your presence. Lord Hakon awaits you in the great hall, though. He wonders at the interesting composition of your party. Lord Hakon, Magnus repeated with just enough emphasis to make clear his opinion of that title. How quickly men acquire new honors when they believe themselves beyond the reach of old laws. The laws evolve with the times, Ulf replied diplomatically, as do the allegiances of wise men who recognize changing circumstances. Bjornulf counted the guards, with automatic precision 20 visible, probably twice that number, positioned where they could not be seen but could respond quickly to trouble. Professional soldiers, well-equipped and alert, but also men who showed the subtle signs of tension that came from serving masters whose orders might change without warning. "We come under formal protocols," Asleif announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had once spoken for Jarls in matters of law and justice. "We seek audience for the presentation of charges according to traditions that predate any man. Here, living." Ulf's composure flickered slightly. The old laws were rarely invoked, but they carried weight that could not be simply dismissed by men who claimed legitimate authority. "What charges?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected. "Treason against sworn lords," Magnus replied formally. "Betrayal of trust given in good faith. Murder of innocents to conceal crimes against honor." He paused, letting each accusation settle like stones cast into still water. "Conspiracy to subvert justice through manipulation of truth. Serious accusations require serious proof," Ulf said, but his hand had moved closer to his sword hilt. "Lord Hakon has served faithfully for. Lord Hakon has served faithfully only his own ambitions." Asleif interrupted, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had spent decades watching powerful men reveal their true natures. "As I am prepared to testify under oath before witnesses, with evidence that cannot be disputed." The great gates of Ravenscroft stood open now, revealing a courtyard where more guards waited and curious faces peered from windows and doorways. This was the moment of commitment, when words spoken in the open air would take on the weight of formal challenge and could not be withdrawn without loss of honor. "Then enter," Ulf said finally, his professional demeanor masking whatever personal feelings he might have about the situation unfolding before him. "Lord Hakon will receive you in the manner appropriate to distinguished guests." As they passed through the gates into the stone embrace of the fortress, Bjornulf felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had once preceded his most dangerous missions. This time, however, the sensation carried different meaning. For 7 years, he had lived with the certainty that his conscience had cost an innocent child her life. Now, surrounded by enemies in their stronghold, he walked toward a confrontation that might finally balance those scales or prove that some debts could never be truly paid. Behind them, the gates closed with the finality of fate itself, sealing them within walls where treachery had been refined to an art and where justice would face its ultimate test against the accumulated cunning of a master manipulator. The great hall of Ravenscroft had been transformed since Bjornulf's last visit years ago, when it served merely as a meeting place for Magnus's extended household. Now it resembled the throne room of a king, with tapestries depicting victories that Hakon had never personally won, and banners bearing heraldry that spoke of authority he had never legitimately earned. At the hall's far end, upon a chair carved from black oak and inlaid with silver that caught the light from dozens of torches, sat the man who had orchestrated 7 years of suffering through careful manipulation of truth and loyalty. Hakon the Wise had aged well in his ascension to power, his hair still thick and dark despite his 60 years, his frame still straight despite decades of preferring negotiation tables to training yards. But it was his eyes that drew attention, intelligent, calculating, and utterly devoid of the doubt or guilt that might have marked a lesser conspirator. This was a man who had committed betrayals that destroyed lives and kingdoms, and who slept peacefully because he believed himself to be serving a greater good that justified any individual sacrifice. "Magnus, my old friend," Hakon called out as they were escorted into his presence by guards whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and secured with hostages. "How good of you to make this arduous journey to visit me in my new home. Though I must say, your choice of traveling companions continues to surprise me." "As do yours," Magnus replied, his gaze sweeping across the assembled courtiers and advisors who clustered around Hakon's chair like carrion birds around a fresh kill. "I see many familiar faces, men, who once swore oaths to very different masters." "Oaths evolve with circumstances," Hakon said smoothly, rising from his throne with the fluid grace of a man who had never doubted his own importance. "Wise men recognize when old loyalties serve new purposes. Though I suspect you have not traveled so far merely to discuss the philosophical implications of changing allegiances." Asleif stepped forward, her elderly frame somehow commanding attention in a hall filled with warriors half her age. "I have come to speak truths that have been too long buried beneath lies and manipulation. Truths about treachery disguised as wisdom, about murder disguised as necessity." "Ah, the healer speaks," Hakon said with the indulgent tone one might use with a confused child. "I remember you well, Asleif Brightweaver. Your skills with herb and needle were considerable, though your understanding of statecraft was always limited. My understanding of evil, however, has proven quite accurate," Asleif replied with the steady courage of someone who had faced death often enough to lose her fear of it. "As has my memory of conversations you thought were private, decisions you believed were secret." For the first time, genuine concern flickered across Hakon's composed features. The carefully orchestrated theatre of his court suddenly felt less secure, as if foundations he had thought unshakable might be built on softer ground than he had assumed. "I invoke the ancient laws," Asleif continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall with the authority of absolute certainty. "I formally accuse Hakon the Wise of treason, betrayal, and murder. I call upon the traditions of our ancestors to demand that he answer these charges in trial by combat, that truth may prevail over deception through the judgment of honest steel." The hall fell silent except for the crackling of torches and the distant sound of wind through stone corridors. Such challenges had not been heard for generations, but every man present understood their implications. This was not political maneuvering or diplomatic negotiation. This was justice, calling treachery to account through methods as old as the mountains themselves. "Trial by combat," Hakon repeated, as if tasting unfamiliar words. "How wonderfully traditional of you, though I fear such ancient customs have little relevance to modern realities." "They have absolute relevance," Magnus said firmly, "to any man who claims authority over others. The old laws bind all who seek to rule, and those who will not defend their honor in combat forfeit all right to command loyalty." Hakon's advisors whispered urgently among themselves, clearly aware that their master faced a legal trap that could not be easily escaped. To refuse the challenge would undermine his authority in the eyes of every warrior who served him. To accept it would mean facing possible death at the hands of a champion whose skills were legendary. "And who serves as your champion in this archaic proceeding?" Hakon asked, though his gaze had already settled on Bjornulf with the recognition of a man who understood exactly how dangerous his situation had become. "I do," Bjornulf said simply, his hand moving to rest on the grip of his axe. "I stand for justice betrayed, innocence murdered, and trust corrupted by a man who preferred manipulation to honor." "Bjornulf Ironhand," Hakon said, and now his voice carried genuine respect mixed with calculation. "The berserker who lost his taste for killing. How ironic that you should find it again in my hall." "I never lost my taste for justice," Bjornulf corrected, "only for serving it through men who proved themselves unworthy of the sacrifice." The two men faced each other across the length of the great hall, and everyone present understood that they stood at the fulcrum of history, where the accumulated betrayals of years would be resolved through the simple arithmetic of blade against blade, skill against skill, truth against treachery. The morning mist clung to the stone courtyard of Ravenscroft like the breath of ancient gods, witness to a ritual as old as the mountains themselves. By the terms of the ancient laws that Hakon could not refuse without forfeiting all claim to authority, the trial by combat would be fought at dawn, in the presence of witnesses whose testimony would carry the weight of absolute truth. Bjornulf stood at the eastern end of the makeshift arena, his weathered axe catching the first rays of sunlight as he performed the familiar ritual of preparation that had preceded every significant battle of his life. 7 years of exile had not dulled the muscle memory that transformed him from village outcast to instrument of justice, each movement precise and economical as a priest conducting sacred ceremony. At the opposite end of the courtyard, Hakon made his own preparations with the careful attention of a man who had survived decades of political intrigue through superior planning and preparation. He had chosen a sword and shield combination that favored defensive fighting over aggressive attack, the weapons of a man who understood that victory often came to those patient enough to allow their enemies to make fatal mistakes. "He's no warrior," Eriki observed quietly from the sidelines, where Magnus's small party watched alongside Hakon's household in an audience that transcended old loyalties. But he survived this long by being smarter than his opponents. "Watch for trickery." Asleif nodded, her hands clasped tightly as she watched the man she had served for decades face the instrument of justice she had helped set in motion. Hakon has always preferred winning through others' weaknesses rather than his own strength. He will have planned for this moment. The formal protocols required a declaration of terms before combat could begin. Captain Ulf, serving reluctantly as witness for both sides, stepped into the 270s, the center of the courtyard with the bearing of a professional soldier who wished he were anywhere else in the world. "This combat is fought under the ancient laws," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Victory goes to the man who lives when the other cannot continue. The judgment rendered here will be final and binding upon all who witness it." Hakon raised his sword in acknowledgement, sunlight running along the blade like liquid silver. "I fight to defend my honor against false accusations made by those who would destroy legitimate authority for personal revenge." Bjornulf lifted his axe in response, the weapon seeming to drink light rather than reflect it. "I fight for truth long buried, innocence murdered, and justice denied by a man who corrupted everything he touched in service to his own ambition." The words hung in the mountain air like incense in a temple, sacred and terrible in their finality. Then Ulf stepped back, raised his hand, and let it fall, like the blade of fate itself. The first moments of combat revealed the fundamental difference between the two men's approaches to violence. Hakon moved with cautious precision, his shield held high, his sword seeking openings that would allow quick strikes without exposing him to the terrible reach of Bjornulf's axe. He fought like a man who understood that this was not a contest of strength, but a problem to be solved through superior tactics. Bjornulf fought like a force of nature unleashed, his axe describing arcs that sang through the air with deadly music. But beneath the apparent fury lay the calculated patience of a master, each attack designed not just to kill, but to drive his opponent toward positions where killing became inevitable. For long minutes, they circled each other in a deadly dance that tested endurance as much as skill. Hakon's defensive strategy was sound. Avoid the axe's devastating power, wait for fatigue to slow the berserker's movements, then strike when opportunity presented itself. But he had underestimated both Bjornulf's conditioning and his capacity for sustained combat. The decisive moment came when Hakon attempted a maneuver that had served him well in practice, a feinted retreat, followed by a sudden thrust aimed at his opponent's exposed side. But Bjornulf had seen such tricks before, in battles where survival depended on reading an enemy's intentions through tiny signals of movement and balance. The axe swept down in a diagonal cut that shattered Hakon's shield and sent him stumbling backward, his left arm hanging useless at his side. For a heartbeat, the outcome seemed certain. Bjornulf raised his weapon for the killing stroke that would end 7 years of exile and betrayal with a single blow. But instead of completing the execution, he stepped back and lowered his axe, his eyes never leaving Hakon's face. "Yield," he said quietly. "Confess your crimes before these witnesses, and I will grant you the mercy you never showed to others." Hakon, blood running down his arm and defeat written in every line of his body, looked up at the man who had spared his life and made a choice that defined everything he truly was, beneath the veneer of wisdom and authority. "Never," he whispered, and lunged forward with his sword in a final, desperate attempt to kill the enemy who had offered him salvation. Bjornulf's axe took him cleanly, ending both his life and his schemes with the finality that justice demanded when mercy was refused. In the silence that followed, Asleif stepped forward to kneel beside the man she had served faithfully for so many years, her healer's instincts stronger than her sense of justice. But there was nothing to heal, nothing to save, only the shell of ambition that had consumed everything noble in a man who might once have been worthy of the loyalty he had commanded. "It's finished," Magnus said simply, and in those words lay the promise of peace that had seemed impossible only days before. Bjornulf stood over his fallen enemy, his axe finally clean of the blood that had stained it for 7 years of exile. Around him, former enemies began the difficult work of becoming allies, united by shared understanding of the price that justice sometimes demanded. The morning mist was lifting now, revealing mountains that had witnessed countless such reckonings and would witness countless more. But for the first time in years, those who had survived this particular reckoning could face the future without the weight of unresolved betrayals and hidden truths. Sometimes, the greatest warriors truly were those who had learned when to lay down their swords, and sometimes they were those who picked them up again when justice called.